So, I'm Tracie Olson, the Public Defender of Yolo County, and I'm very happy to be here tonight to speak to you all at this event about this topic. It's my opinion that events like this and discussions like this and education that we give to each other and to the people that we know are what will, in the very end, lead to the abolition of the death penalty here in California. But I say that from my personal experience. And to tell you something about me and my family, I grew up in a military family. So my father is a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force. My brother, my little brother, who's 40, is a career officer in the United States Air Force. My husband is a C-5 reservist in the United States Air Force. And I am very proud of that, but for anybody that knows what military men and women are like, you also know that they tend to have conservative political views. So for me, it wasn't really until I went to college, and I went to UC Davis right here in Yolo County, and it wasn't until I went to college and I got exposed to information and education and other people with different viewpoints that I was able to formulate my own opinions about what I thought about things. And I very early, obviously, came to the conclusion that the death penalty is wrong. And I was one of those kids that I would go home from college and I would tell my parents everything I learned and how I was right and they were wrong. And so you can imagine when I was, say, sophomore, junior in college, and I'm home at Thanksgiving or Sunday or whatever it was, laundry day, and I was having a conversation with my military father and my very dedicated military wife mother and my brother who'd probably just finished boot camp at that time and was very indoctrinated. And we would have conversations about everything, lots of things, but some were about the death penalty. And sometimes I felt like I was talking to brick walls, and I'm sure that my opinions as I articulated them back in 1990 were probably not as educated or sophisticated as I hope they are now. But I never really felt like I was making much progress. But to my parents' credit and to my family's credit, we always engaged in the conversation. They were always open, and we talked about the same themes over and over. And so what the themes were that I talked about were, you know, Dad, Mom, do you understand there are people that plead not guilty. They go to trial, they're convicted. They go to death row because a jury says that's what they think is appropriate. Am I cutting a little bit? And they would sit on death row for years until some of them had the ability to get exonerated. And so I'd usually get responses from my family that were along the lines of, well, how long did they sit on death row? I'd say, well, for years, sometimes a decade. And the responses were, well, they got released, right? Okay.
Let's see if we can figure out how to do it. You've been cutting out.
So I'm starting over. No, I'm not going to start over. So back to the dinner table. So the themes that I would always impress and talk about with my parents involved ideas of, you know, people that go to trial, people that are not guilty but end up on death row and are exonerated years later. And I used to get the responses that were, well, they were exonerated, right? They were released, right? And like somehow that solved the issue. And those of you that are now remembering conversations like that with your family realize how frustrating a response like that is. But those were some of the early responses that I did get from my family. I would say things like, you understand how expensive the death penalty is. And I could say, for instance, now, the death penalty has cost California about $4 billion since 1978. That To litigate a death penalty case costs 10 to 20 times more than to litigate a murder case that does not involve the death penalty. I could say that in 2010 alone, there's an estimate that it costs $58 million simply to prosecute, or defend and prosecute post-conviction matters on behalf of people in prison in state court, not federal court, just state court. It costs about $70 million more to keep those 700 or some people, I think it's 712 last I heard, on death row in California, versus just to put them in the regular population. I would be able to tell them that there's no evidence the death penalty deters crime. That if you look at the average murder rate in death penalty states and compare it to the average murder rate in non-death penalty states, those with the death penalty have a higher rate across the board almost every time. I could tell my family, and I did tell my family, when you hear that people accused of capital crimes need to be put to death because they pose more of a danger to either correctional staff or other inmates in prison, I could tell them there's no study, no evidence that supports that. I could tell them that, life without parole means you don't parole. And that's a perfectly acceptable alternative. And I also told my family, in 2002, the United States Supreme Court had decided that it was a cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment and the evolving standards of decency to put to death mentally retarded criminals. In 2005, also under the evolving standards of decency, the Supreme Court of the United States said that those that were in prison that had committed the crimes when they were kids also cannot be put to death. I tell my parents recently, New Jersey, Illinois, they've joined 12 other states and they do not execute their people. I tell them that the Western European nations, there's none, either in law because of their laws or because of their practice, that execute their citizens. The United Nations General Assembly has put out a formal resolution that says that the goal for the world is to reduce the number of crimes that are eligible for the death penalty with the end goal of making sure that that punishment is no longer available for anyone. I tell them that opposing the death penalty, it's not disrespectful to murder victims. It's not having lack of sympathy for murder victims' families. Instead, opposing the death penalty is respecting human life. I'd remind them that there are murder victims' families, many of them that do not want their loved ones' deaths avenged by murder. We don't hear them as often, we don't hear them as loud, but they exist. And probably in the last year, I heard my dad, who's 70 years old, so Lieutenant Colonel Keith Malone, talking to somebody that he knew. And they were talking about the death penalty for some reason. And my dad said, "Do you know that 100 people have been exonerated off of death row?" And I thought, finally, these discussions have meant something. And it's the education that I think is the key. It is events like this that are the key. And I thank you all for being here.